For the month of February 2012, DAWS 3D has given away a free edition of DAWS Studio 4 Pro, Bryce 7 Pro, and Hexagon 2.5. These are all very powerful programs that are normally quite costly, and I don't want to go into too much detail about what each of them does, but in this video we're going to be using Bryce 7 Pro in order to create some terrain for CryEngine 3. Now, a lot of you might remember a tutorial series by Just My Games member Class in which he created some of the most amazing looking terrain I've ever seen in a video game. Problem was the tutorial took over 4 hours and required some expensive software, but if you're into achieving the best quality, then you definitely need to check that series out. In this tutorial, however, we're going to be achieving some good quality, and it's only going to take us about 10 minutes. So once you download and install your free copy of Bryce 7 Pro, we're going to go into Bryce and we're going to start a new document. And set your render resolution to 1024 by 1024 because that's a fairly decent sized terrain. That's what I'm going to use it for this tutorial. So I will warn you that this is my first time using Bryce, so I'm not very familiar with the program at all, and there's a few times throughout the video where I'm actually going to be asking for your help and your feedback through the forums and in the comments in this video to see if you guys can achieve better results and what techniques and things you learned with the program. So first I'm just going to click this terrain looking icon to generate a terrain, and be careful, there's no keyboard controls that I found for maneuvering the camera, so you're just going to rely on these controls over here on the left, which are pretty self-explanatory, but in truth I'm not going to be using Bryce to maneuver or inspect my terrain or fine-tune it very much. I'm actually going to head straight to the Edit tab, and on the far right click this black and white looking icon, and this will bring me into the height map editor. And you can certainly use these tools to play with modifying the height map yourself. However, I'm just going to head to the fractal generator, and you can see next to fractal drop down you have a lot of options for different styles of terrain. One that I found that looks decent is the round hills, and so once I generate the round hills, I'm actually going to apply the eroded modifier, and then I'm going to apply a Gaussian edges to basically bring the edges down so I can hide them in water or something like that. And I'm actually going to want to double check that my resolution is also set to 1024, which I did not do, so I'm going to need to regenerate my terrain and reapply these modifiers. Now I'm ready to export the height map portion of my terrain, so I'm going to select this drop down and select export image. And unfortunately Bryce is a little limited on file formats. However, I'm going to use a TIFF, and I'm just going to name it TER1 for terrain 1. And I'm also going to export, rather than export image, I'm just going to export and select PGM. So PGM and TIFF are both file types that CryEngine will import, so I'm just going to play with them both and see what looks better. Now I'll hit the check mark, head back to the main screen, and now I'll select the far left icon in the Edit tab, which is for modifying my material. And I'm just going to select one of the predefined terrains. Make sure you're under the terrain tab down here. I'm just going to head to vegetation, and I suppose I'll go with the Mediterranean hills. Some of them I noticed don't look very good at all, but I believe this one looks okay. So then I'm going to bring in my camera somewhere decent and just do a quick render. Rendering is this button down here, which you probably never guess, just to make sure that it doesn't look horrible. It'll take just a moment, and that looks like it's going to be good enough. So now I'm going to actually export this entire object. Let me cancel the render by moving my camera. Okay, so I've not yet found a way to individually export the material files on their own, so what I'm actually doing is just exporting 3ds mesh export, which unfortunately is going to take a while because it's also going to export 3ds mesh. It's something that you could use in a modeling program like Max, but it's also going to give me my material files, including a diffuse, ambient, bump, and specular if you like, whichever ones you set up for. Make sure you set the size, and actually I'm going to set the size for the images to be 2048 by 2048 because CryEngine allows you to use slightly larger texture than your terrain height map. the format's going to be bitmap. That's the only type that CryEngine allows for large full terrain textures, and I'm going to export that, which is probably going to take a minute. Now you should have quite a few files that you're ready to play with. Let's go ahead and load our editor. Now I'm going to start a new map, and I'll name it TER1, and I'm going to make sure it's 1024 by 1024 with 1 meter per unit. The PGM terrain height map will only work when the meters per unit is 1. I'll show you what I mean here in a second. Then I'll import my terrain, which is the PGM. And the PGM generally looks a little bit better than the TIFF. The TIFF would give me some blocky textures, and so I recommend you use that before you use the TIFF. And you can see how it's way too tall, so I'm going to set the max terrain height to about 300, which works well for 1024 width and length, and then I'm going to re-import the height map, and that looks pretty decent. I accidentally hit my brush there. Anyways, sometimes you're still going to end up with some you can see some rough edges and whatnot, so I personally like to run a smooth modifier on the entire map 1 or 2 times really, and then, or if you're meticulous, you might just want to hand smooth out the areas that actually need it. Not sure why this area is so blocky, but yeah, generally it looks pretty good overall. Might need some tuning up, which is actually easier to do once you can see the terrain on your texture. Now there's 2 methods for applying textures to your terrain, and one is to use the height map, which was generated from Bryce, which you can see here. The DIFFCOL for diffused color is the one that you'd be applying to your entire terrain. And actually, for some reason, and the same thing happened with Class's long tutorial series, they always come out rotated, so you need to rotate them 90 degrees clockwise. Save that, and I'm actually going to save it as a CryTIFF. Actually, excuse me, BMP needs to remain a BMP. Is the only format for a for an entire terrain. So then you just need to head to the terrain, export, import terrain texture, and actually we need to set this tile size before we do that, because if you remember, we saved that to 2048 by 2048. So you head into your layer painter, and at the bottom you hit change tile resolution. Then you click the tile that you want to change and you set the resolution. So now that's changed to 2048, and we're ready to import our terrain texture. And once you close it, your terrain should appear. So I think it's pretty decent looking for such a quick process, and I'm very interested to see what kind of results with some enhancements and what types of things you learn, and if you guys can offer any sort of tips back through comments and forums. It always looks nice if you generate the surface textures and include the terrain sky calculation, and the higher you do this, the better it's going to look, but you'll see here in a moment how much better it looks. Now here's that process finished. Specifically the water is what looks better, reflecting off the terrain. Okay, so there's one problem with using this technique, and that is when you get up close, I find these checkerboards, and there might be a solution for that. Hopefully someone can get back to me. Who knows? But one makeshift solution is to set the in the environment tab the detail layers view distance ratio to 0, and that means that basically from any distance it's going to keep that texture the same. From far away the terrain looks nice, and anyways, this is just the first method of applying terrain. So now I'm going to apply textures. Now I'm going to apply the textures manually with some texture layers. Now ideally you'd probably choose one or the other, but I'm going to go ahead and try mixing them both just to see what kind of results it gives me, and because the process is the same, so you would just start with the terrain with the default gray and then start adding your layers like I'm about to do. So I'll head to my texture tab and I'll add a few layers. And if you're synced with the CryEngine repository, which is a free community game that justmakegames.com is developing, then you'll have all these textures in your textures folder. So yeah, anybody can feel free to use these on their terrain and achieve similar results. And I'm actually applying a gray, the 64 by 64 DDS texture to all my layer textures, which is contrary to what I've done in the past. However, it seems to be what Crytek does, and it works fine if you set the colors manually like I'm about to show you. So for this, I'll just quickly do 3 textures, assign them each to the proper layer, and do some quick painting. Now, like I said, this might mess things up. You probably want to start with just your default gray texture and start painting, but we'll see what effect this has. Okay, so what's happening here is when you set that to 0, you're never going to see the close-up textures. You're only ever going to see the far-away texture. When you, depending on how high you set it, will determine how far away you can see the closer texture. So if it's 5, the well, it goes pretty far back. So if it's 1, the close-up textures are going to disappear fairly quickly. Right there you can see. So you set that higher depending on how far you want to see them. So you can see that actually looks pretty decent if you combine the large overlay texture with some layer painting of, okay, I'll go with the grass and I'll do a huge brush, which might break some people's computer. With CryEngine 3 tends to crash a lot. Okay, so now you can see that not only does our terrain look decent from far away, but also from close up, we still have a nice looking texture. So the biggest problem I'm finding right now with combining both texture techniques is that when hand painting the textures, you're not really having any control over the brightness or the color. It's just setting the close-up texture, which is actually fine if you're willing to go by and hand draw only on the colored portions that you wish for the texture to be different. So for example, if I want to paint this rock here on all the white areas I see in my map, then I can do so. However, if I wanted to paint some rock over here in the grass, it's going to come out green. So you really don't have control over that. But in all honesty, depending on how much you fine-tune the large overlay texture, then that might be a perfectly viable way to do this. In fact, I think it looks pretty good. However, if you want to have more fine-tuning control, then I'll quickly show you from scratch painting a few different layers. And I just want to quickly mention again that if you do sync up with the CryEngine repository, like I explained in one of our other videos, then you will have access to all these materials, which I think blend quite nicely. And what I've done is just I've set a layer for each one, and then I'm just changing the layer texture for each one to be the default gray. And then I will individually play with the colors and brightness in the actual layer painter. Okay, once I have my base foundation texture down, then I like to actually apply the rest of my textures using the altitude and slope variables. And by the way, you know, you're probably going to want to fine-tune your terrain a little bit, make these actually look like lakes or smooth, you know, imperfections out and things like that, obviously. But so I'm going to head to the next one, which might be a mud grass, and then say only between altitude of 0 and 20, which might be a little bit above water level. And sometimes you need to go close up to test what it's doing before zooming out and applying it to the entire map, and it looks like that's not really hitting anything. So yeah, 0 to 40 is going to get me a decent there, and I actually want to do the opposite. I want to go from 40 to maybe 80. so that the mud is what's closest to the water. And now you can see this mudgrass texture is only being painted from the heights 40 to 80. And then it's also nice that you can throw in some slopes in there also, so you only want the mudgrass on very mellow slopes from 40 to 120, and you'd say a slope of 0 to 30, and you can see it doesn't apply it to everything, because let's say you want the rock texture to go from 30 to 90, then that would fill in those extra areas. You can see as that's done there. And so that's what I was doing when I first started the video. And actually, one thing I forgot here is to set the colors on any of my terrain layers, because we're not using the layer texture bitmaps anymore. Then go ahead and set these colors, and when you find something that you like, then you'll apply it, and then that way when you switch textures it'll still be there when you go back. You also need to play with the brightness to find the right settings, and so I think this is going to be an overall slightly darker map. But anyway, that works well. So then if you say on the entire map you only want, well, starting from above the mudgrass, so from altitude of 40 to 1000, you only want anything between 0 and 25 degrees to be grass. So then only fairly flat areas are going to be covered in grass. So here all I've done so far is set the mud to paint everything from 0 to 1000 with a slope of 0 to 90, but then I set the grass to only paint from 40 and above, so not anything close to the water, and also from only a slope of 0 to 45, so anything with a steeper slope is going to remain mud. And then I'm actually going to, this part takes some time and thinking, just fill in the steeper spots with some transitions, maybe from 45 to 50 degrees with the mud grass, and then from 50 and on with the rock, and then some dirt in some areas. So I'll take a few minutes to fine tune this. For example, what I've done here is I've selected the mudgrass texture now, and I'm going to go from a slope of 43 to 47, so 2 above and 2 below where the grass is, and then I'm going to set the hardness down and then just do some light strokes everywhere, and you can see the transition that affects between the mud and the grass is now a little line of mudgrass. And then I'll keep fine-tuning the whole map with more textures. So at this point I've actually applied all 5 textures using the calculation variables for slope and height, and I believe we have a fairly nice result considering the time and effort put in was almost nothing. I'm really interested to hear some feedback. Hopefully we'll hear from some people who actually know how to use Bryce, or some people who experiment with this process and found some better ways to do some of the things that I did wrong. Thanks a lot. Check out justmakegames.com and have fun making games.